Hey guys, I want to talk to you about a little trick that I always do whenever I'm picking out a food item, like either a sauce or a snack or something from the grocery store. I always turn that item around that container and I look at two things. I'm going to look at the nutrition label. Really, I'm just looking at calories and comparing protein between two things. But I'll also pick stuff based on what's on the ingredients label. There's one thing on ingredients labels that I most often try to avoid as best as I can. And that's going to be high fructose corn syrup. Now, I know you've heard a lot of people tell you to avoid high fructose corn syrup in the past, but there's a lot of fear-mongering and a lot of misinformation about why they do that. So I want to tell you why I avoid high fructose corn syrup and kind of get you to think about food a little bit differently. Now, one thing to note is high fructose corn syrup is not actually that bad for you. It's not inherently evil. It doesn't make food bad. There was a bunch of headlines that kind of sensationalized fructose and by effect high fructose corn syrup. But those were all kind of based on some studies that use some less than ideal methods in their experiments. The studies that really lambasted and blamed fructose for a lot of negative health outcomes, they did studies where people consumed about 300 to 500 grams of fructose a day. The problem with that is when you take people's normal eating habits, they tend to average about 60 up to 90. And when you study different upper limits, it finds that the body can process about 100 to 120 grams of fructose a day before any negative health benefits or health detriments come into effect. In the group that eats the most fructose, they're going to be teenagers, and they still top out at about 80, unless they're pounding those big gulps of Mountain Dew during lunch. Then they get up into that unhealthy range. But as it is, fructose, most commonly referred to as fruit sugars, not actually an enemy for your health. And it makes sense if the biggest source of fructose comes from fruit, and people tell you to eat fruits and vegetables. It makes sense that that's actually not going to be bad for you. So I don't tell people to avoid high fructose corn syrup because it's inherently bad. The reason why I want people to avoid high fructose corn syrup is because of the processing. It's kind of a litmus test for that food product. In the processing stages, if they're using a lot of high fructose corn syrup, they tend to choose to opt for cheaper ingredients throughout the process. And that just... I'm not convinced the cheaper ingredients are always the most digestible. I think that causes a lot of gastrointestinal irritations for a lot of people, a lot of food intolerances. I think probably more able to ascribe that to some of the cheaper manufacturing products that we put into foods. Another thing that I want people to avoid is foods that have high fructose corn syrup. They're usually a little bit more engineered to be really highly palatable. That encourages people to really enjoy the food and to eat more of it, so that your calorie portions get out of whack, because it tricks your brain into wanting more and more of it, so you tend to overeat foods that have high fructose corn syrup in it. So it really wrecks diets and it causes overeating. And that's going to be really bad for most fitness goals. So I have people avoid high fructose corn syrup, not because it's inherently bad, but because it serves more as a litmus test for the food to try to avoid hyperpalatability and to avoid food that causes irritations in digestion. So I think that's a valuable thing when you're going through the grocery store. If you do grab something from the middle aisles, the little more processed foods, check it out, pull it back, check the ingredients label. If there is high fructose corn syrup, I most often recommend you avoid that. I'll admit that I do usually use Yoshida's Gourmet marinade and sauce like 2-3 times a month. I really like the taste. It's got high fructose corn syrup. It's my exception to the rule, but it's something that I generally avoid most often to avoid the hyperpalatability and to increase the digestibility of the food that I eat. So when you're out, try to avoid high fructose corn syrup, but if you do have it, there's nothing inherently evil, nothing inherently unhealthy about it. It's just something that we want to minimize and avoid for our positive habits.